If you're ready, let's go ahead and start chapter 5 and let's talk about culture. Yes, I like culture, mostly the bacterial kind. Well, this is my attention getter. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Shows that I do know what a meme is, but barely. What we want to talk about today is culture, how we understand it, prejudice within culture, individual versus collectivism in culture, and communication across cultures. The book gives us a clear definition of what culture is. Culture consists of beliefs, behaviors, objects, and other characteristics common to members of a particular group or society. Culture is everything. I mean, we have a family culture, we have a culture at the school, we have a culture at work, we have all these different cultures that we're a part of. And each of them are impacting us in different ways, helping us define who we are, and they're normally right in on that sphere of influence, really helping us identify ourselves. Now, the book uses a quote from Keesing in 1974, and they use this to help define what culture is. But as we've spoken about with interpersonal communication, it's a dynamic thing. So sometimes when we reach back and we look at aspects of something that happened long ago, it's changes. Remember, in 1974, they were crazy that the world was overpopulated. We have 3 billion people in the world. It's going to have no food. We're out of resources. In 2020, we have almost 8 billion people in the world. And we still have the same concerns in some areas, but what they said in 1974 doesn't really come forward. And as you'll find out with Keesing, he also changed his. What he did is initially he looked at culture as being a regional thing, looked at the aspects of religion, looked at the world as they were viewing it at that time. What he changed it to, though, is that culture can sometimes be hidden within another culture, and that we have these co-cultures that make up a larger society. So it's not just a simple case of, oh, there's this culture and that culture. There might be bleed over, there might be a mixture of cultures going on. So he instead asked about to see connections that otherwise be hidden. And as you can see here with these punk rockers from the 80s, yeah, that was a culture that was within the rock culture, that was within the music culture, that was within the Western civilization culture. And it just kind of was very dynamic in its approach. So what do you think about what Keesing was saying? Do you think he was more correct in 1974 when he was more of a regional individual looking at cultures along the larger groups? Or when he redefined it in 2006, do you think he more adapted it? And do you think it would change in 2020? The reason why I like the punk rocker picture is not only because I lived during that period of time, but because it reminds us that we can't generalize about a group. We can't generalize, oh, well, they're rock fans, so this is what they are. Well, if you were alive at that time, you had pop music going on at the same time as rock music, at the same time as punk rock, at the same time as metal, and is even diversified from there. And what we found out that what you attribute to one group just based on culture, you can attribute across the co-cultures that you find. And I'm going to go into why I'm calling them co-cultures versus subcultures here in a moment. But there are social norms within those cultures that might interlink a little bit with the originating, but they might vary greatly. The traits of culture. Culture is learned. Now, the culture that we grew up in, we learned it. We didn't just come out and say, oh, well, this is my culture and I already know everything about it, I'm done. No, instead, our parents taught us, our aunts, our uncles, our friends, the people that lived across the street, the newspapers, the radio, all those helped us learn what our culture was. Additionally, we communicate our culture. We share our culture through how we talk. In some case, there might be a lingo that goes along with it. Hey, I'm hip, I'm down with that, cool. All those things are part of a cultural formation of communication. And so at times people from another culture have a hard time identifying what we're saying. There was a good reference to a joke that for the people that grew up in um, Eastern Europe, that was funny. But to the people that grew up here in the United States, it's like, I don't get it. And that happens a lot. We see that going both directions. So culture is communicated. Culture is layered. It's not just, oh, well, this is this culture and that's how everyone is in it. No, because there are those co-cultures within a culture. And so it can be complex or it can be very diverse. And culture is lived. We live our culture. If we decide we're going to go ahead and become vegans, for instance, we have to live that culture, because it is part of a culture. Or if we decide we're going to go and we're going to live the life of people in the wilderness, well, you can't live in New York City and embrace the culture of the wild. So yes, we live our culture as well. Now, why co-culture versus subculture? This is actually one of those terms that we started thinking about when we're talking about appropriating other people's cultures. When we talk about taking something from someone and making our in-group higher than the out-group. So instead, say I'm a big rock fan, which I am, I would automatically say, oh, well, you know, uh, pop, it's a subculture, which means rock is here, pop is there. That lowers their culture. So we tend to call things a subculture, which messes with our mind when we start looking at our in-groups and out-groups. Because once again, we're boosting ourselves up by putting someone else down. So instead, if we call something a co-culture, we're creating more of a shared equality. And we don't think of them as inferior, we think of them, and that gives importance to their culture. And this can be broken down by ethnic groups, minorities, religions, even diversity within music or taste of movies. I mean, because there is a sci-fi culture in the world. Subgroups are groups based on vocation, avocation, special skills, cultures. Like I said, once again, we go more towards that. Let's look at them as a co-culture. Now, we can break down these co-cultures based on different aspects. When we talked about the restaurant analogy earlier, the kitchen is a co-culture to the wait staff, which is a co-culture to the management. And each of them have their own different functions and different vocations, but they all are contributing to the overall social success of the business. So you look at the fact that we do share within a society multiple cultures. Now, within cultures, there is a dominant culture. And that's why we started changing that terminology from subculture and moving it over to co-culture. Because dominant ones have a tendency to take what they like and call it part of their own. And they assimilate the other cultures they come in contact with, kind of like the Borg, they take over everything. And that's not necessarily good because we lose a lot of our diversity, a lot of the beauty within society when we start assimilating cultures. And that's something we need to watch for. Prejudice. Now, this is something, if you're going to ask, well, what does Brad spend a lot of his time studying and writing papers on and presenting on? This is starting to get into that. I look at different aspects of dehumanization. I'm working on my doctoral on the basis of how storytelling can be used to promote a culture or groups versus break us apart. And for that reason, I read a lot about this stuff. Prejudice is unjustified and incorrect attitude, normally negative. Some people can say, oh, it can be a positive prejudice, which, yes, we can do that with our in-group especially. We can look at them and say, oh, well, they're stubborn and that's a good thing, type of thing. So we do apply that in some ways. But normally it's negative and it's based solely on the individual's membership within a group. There's the stereotype. Now, I've heard people say, well, stereotypes are based on fact or based on observation. No. Really, stereotypes are us projecting what we expect. And that's when we start going back and we look at that self-fulfilling prophecy aspect of it, where we're saying, oh, well, I'm going to look for. And then that is also when we stop listening to people for content, and instead we're listening to them to confirm our biases. So stereotypes are a negative thing for the most part. There's also malevolent prejudice. You think of a group as inferior, but you're friendly towards it. Oh, well, that group of people, they're great at telling jokes, so hey, yeah, sure, they can't run a business, but boy, they tell good jokes. Or some other type where you can actually start hearing how the prejudice is actually in there. But it's being disguised, it's being glossed over by pointing out something positive about the group at the same time as knocking them down. Hostile prejudice, this is the straight up prejudice, is unfriendly and totally against a group of people based on their association with a culture or a group. Communication and prejudice. Now, we've talked about the communication model a little bit, and I know people out there are saying, well, I really don't have any prejudices. We all do. It's part of our human condition. We have a bias, we have some prejudices, and the only thing that gives those power is when we ignore that we have them or we feed them. And so we have to is acknowledge them in order to overcome it in our communication with one another. The most simplest form that we talked about, communication, where it's a dynamic process, there's two people involved, and we're sending a message to a second person, we're encoding it and transmitting it, and they're decoding it, and it's all going through the noise, and there's a feedback loop. There's all that fun stuff. But prejudice breaks down this model because it is more noisy than anything else that we insert into our communication. Here once again is our little model. Noise is down there. Of course, nothing is as simple as it seems. Communication, regardless of the route, there's always noise. Noise can take many forms. As you see, a washing machine, a hair dryer, people talking, airplanes going overhead, the thunderstorm that seems to be rolling in today, all that creates noise. But the most difficult noise to overcome in communication is our own biases and our own prejudices. Prejudice can modify the context of a message, how it is received, and how we decode it. Now, many things can create this prejudice or this bias, these in-groups and these out-groups, which we're a part of no matter what we do. And some of them can be based on any of these topics. And there's many more. This list is not totally inclusive. If we're doing an inclusive list, we'd all have to sit together in a room and write for a day, and we'd still leave some out. But these are the common ones we often see. We can be prejudiced based on ethnic groups. We can be prejudiced based on disabilities, religion, age, sexuality, gender, race. All these are common forms that we will find our prejudice or biases within. So I want you to take a moment, because this is our last slide before we enter into part 2, and think about which of these groups have you felt that you've been prejudiced against, or that you have been the victim of prejudice in. I mean, was it when you were 18 years old and you applied for a job that you knew you were qualified for, and they looked at you and said, you're not old enough. You don't have enough experience. Is it perhaps a disability? Is it perhaps a religion? Is it perhaps an ethnic group, race? Anything where you've either witnessed it or been part of. that you've either had to overcome, like you had to go back and you had to reapply for that job and you had to really demonstrate that, hey, my age doesn't change who I am. I'm still a good worker. So go ahead and go post something down here on that, and I'll see you on part 2.